He brushed against the shopping cart, nothing more than fabric touching metal. But Tommy Berkowitz saw an opportunity to unleash 15 years of pent-up rage on someone who couldn't fight back. The 78-year-old man stumbled backward, his weathered hands instinctively reaching for balance that his arthritic joints couldn't provide. The grocery bags scattered across the parking lot asphalt, canned goods rolling between parked cars like scattered memories of better days. "Watch where you're going, old man." Tommy's voice carried the particular cruelty that comes from knowing your victim is defenseless. At 33, with arms covered in tattoos that told stories of bar fights and bad decisions, he towered over the elderly figure now struggling to gather his spilled groceries. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the Walmart parking lot in Riverside, California, turning the asphalt into a furnace that made every movement exhausting. The old man didn't respond with anger. He didn't curse or threaten. Instead, Harold Martinez simply began picking up his scattered items with the patient dignity of someone who had learned long ago that some battles aren't worth fighting. His movements were careful, deliberate, each bend of his knee a testament to joints that had carried him through decades of service most people couldn't imagine. A can of soup here, a loaf of bread there, gathering the simple necessities that comprised his weekly shopping trip. But Tommy wasn't finished. The silence seemed to infuriate him more than any retort would have. "You deaf, Grandpa? I'm talking to you." He stepped closer, his shadow falling across Harold's bent form like a dark promise. The few shoppers who witnessed the scene hurried past, eyes averted, phones suddenly very interesting, everyone desperately pretending they didn't see what was happening. This was America in 2024, where recording a confrontation for social media was more common than actually intervening. A young mother pulling her child along walked faster when the boy pointed and asked why the man was being mean to the grandpa. A teenage employee collecting shopping carts suddenly found urgent business at the far end of the lot. An elderly couple in a sedan chose that moment to study their shopping list with intense concentration. The bystander effect in full display, 50 feet from the entrance of a store, where a corporate policy of customer service excellence was posted on every wall. Tommy grabbed Harold's shoulder, spinning him around with unnecessary force. "Look at me when I'm talking to you, you worthless piece of..." The words died in his throat as he found himself staring into eyes that had seen things Tommy's worst nightmares couldn't conjure. Eyes that held depths of experience carved by years most people pray they'll never have to live through. For just a moment, something in those eyes made Tommy's bravado falter. But the moment passed. The crowd of onlookers had grown, phones emerging now that the situation promised entertainment rather than requiring intervention. Tommy felt the attention, felt the need to perform, to prove something to an audience that expected a show. "What's wrong with you, freak? Cat got your tongue?" He shoved Harold again, harder this time, sending the old man stumbling against a parked truck. Harold's hand went to his chest, fingers finding the spot where dog tags had once hung, now empty but still carrying the phantom weight of identification that had defined him for so many years. His breathing became labored, not from fear, but from the sudden rushing of memories triggered by confrontation. Desert sand, the sound of helicopters, the weight of a rifle that had been as familiar as his own heartbeat. Brothers who hadn't made it home. "Please." Harold's voice was quiet, dignified, carrying the measured tone of someone who had given orders to men whose lives depended on clear communication. "I don't want any trouble." But Tommy heard weakness where there was actually strength, saw surrender where there was actually strategic patience. The circle of observers tightened, smartphones held high, social media already calculating the viral potential of elderly abuse caught on camera. Comments would flow like digital bloodsport. "Should have fought back." "This is what's wrong with America. Where are the real men?" But none of them would step forward. None of them would risk their own safety for a stranger's dignity. Tommy pulled back his fist, the motion captured by a dozen different angles for a dozen different feeds, his knuckles aimed at a face that had seen more honor in a single day of service than Tommy would witness in his entire lifetime. The blow was coming, inevitable as gravity, suspended in that eternal moment before impact when everything changes forever. But then a sound cut through the parking lot noise like a sword through silk, the distinctive rumble of motorcycles, not the casual weekend rider variety, but the deep, purposeful growl of machines built for men who understood the meaning of brotherhood. The sound grew closer, more insistent, carrying with it the promise that this confrontation was about to take a very different turn. Tommy's fist hesitated in midair as heads turned toward the approaching sound. Harold's eyes lifted, recognition flickering across his weathered features like sunrise after the longest night. Because those weren't just any motorcycles approaching, and the riders wearing matching leather vests weren't just any group of middle-aged bikers out for an afternoon cruise. That wasn't just any old man about to be beaten in a parking lot by a coward with an audience of enablers. And what was about to happen next would remind everyone present that some debts can never be forgotten, and some bonds can never be broken, no matter how many years pass or how far apart life takes you from the brothers who once stood beside you when the world was trying to kill you both. The motorcycles were getting closer now, their riders visible in the distance, and Harold Martinez was no longer just a 78-year-old man gathering scattered groceries while strangers recorded his humiliation. He was about to become something much more dangerous to Tommy's worldview. He was about to become a reminder that heroism doesn't retire, dignity doesn't have an expiration date, and some uniforms are worn on the inside where they can never be taken off. Harold Martinez had been 19 when he first heard that sound. Not motorcycles, but helicopters, their rotors beating the humid Vietnamese air into submission as they carried young American soldiers into landing zones that existed somewhere between courage and terror. He'd been a machine gunner with the 1st Cavalry Division, part of an era when boys became men in the space between one heartbeat and the next, when survival meant trusting the person next to you more than you trusted yourself. The grocery store. Parking lot faded away as memories rushed back with startling clarity. Firebase Charlie, 1969. The monsoon rains that turned everything into mud and misery. The weight of the M60 machine gun that had been both his burden and his salvation. The faces of men whose names were carved into black granite in Washington, D.C. Men who had shared their rations, their fears, their last letters home with a kid from East Los Angeles who just wanted to make it back to see his mother's face again. But Harold had made it back, carrying with him the invisible wounds that no parade could heal, no welcome home ceremony could close. He'd returned to a country that didn't want to hear about his service, that treated Vietnam veterans like embarrassing reminders of an unpopular war. No hero's welcome, no grateful nation, just a bus ticket home and a government that would spend the next 50 years trying to pretend that war had never happened. Tommy's voice seemed to come from very far away. "You listening to me, old man?" But Harold was listening to something else entirely. The sound of approaching motorcycles had triggered something deeper than memory, something that lived in the part of his soul that had been forged in combat and tempered by brotherhood. Because that particular rumble, that specific rhythm of perfectly synchronized engines, belonged to the Riverside chapter of Combat Veterans Motorcycle Association. They met every Tuesday at Denny's on Magnolia Avenue. Harold had been meaning to join them for months, but something always held him back. Maybe it was the thought that they wouldn't accept a machine gunner who still woke up some nights with the taste of jungle rot in his mouth. Maybe it was the fear that after 55 years of carrying his service alone, he wouldn't know how to share it with others who understood. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe he was just tired of being reminded that most of his brothers hadn't made it home to grow old and get pushed around in parking lots. But Carl Rodriguez had tracked him down anyway. Somehow the chapter president had gotten Harold's address, had shown up at his small apartment with a cup of coffee and infinite patience. "We know you're out there," Carl had said, his own weathered face carrying the map lines of someone who had seen his share of hard country. 96th Transportation Company and KA, 1967 to 1968. Lost my best friend to a mortar attack that should have killed me instead. They'd talked for 3 hours that first day. Then Carl had come back the next week, and the week after that, slowly drawing Harold out of the shell he'd built around his memories. "You don't have to carry it alone anymore, brother," Carl had said. "We're all carrying the same weight. Might as well carry it together." The motorcycles were in the parking lot now. 8 machines in a perfect V formation, their riders dismounting with the measured precision of men who had learned discipline in places where sloppy technique meant death. Each wore the same leather vest, the same patches that identified them as members of something larger than themselves. Combat Veterans Motorcycle Association. Brothers who had served in different wars, different decades, but who shared the common experience of having sworn an oath to defend something bigger than their own lives. Carl Rodriguez led them, his gray beard neatly trimmed, his movements still carrying the confident authority of someone who had been responsible for other men's lives in situations where hesitation meant catastrophe. Behind him came David Park, Korean War veteran whose hands still trembled slightly from frostbite he'd suffered at Chosin Reservoir. Then Miguel Santos, who'd lost his left leg to an IED in Fallujah but whose stride on his prosthetic carried no hint of self-pity. Jerry Washington, whose Bronze Star with V device was earned in a rice paddy outside Da Nang when he was younger than most of the college students who now protested wars they'd never seen. They'd gotten the call from Mrs. Chen, Harold's neighbor, who had watched him leave for his weekly grocery run and worried when he didn't return on schedule. She'd called the number Carl had left with her just in case. "Something's wrong," she'd said. "Harold never takes this long at the store." So they'd mounted their motorcycles and ridden out like they were responding to a distress call from a firebase under siege, because that's exactly what this was. Tommy was still posturing, still playing to his audience of phone-wielding spectators, but his voice had taken on a slightly uncertain edge. The arrival of 8 leather-clad bikers had shifted the dynamic in ways his limited imagination couldn't quite process. These weren't the kind of bikers you saw in movies, all bluster and chains and theatrical menace. These were something else, entirely. Quiet, disciplined, purposeful. Men who moved like they had trained together, who communicated with glances and small gestures refined over decades of shared experience. "What's this, old man?" Tommy's bravado was cracking around the edges. "Called your nursing home friends to come save you?" But Harold wasn't looking at Tommy anymore. He was looking at Carl Rodriguez, who had stopped 10 feet away and was studying the situation with the calm assessment of someone who had learned to read tactical situations quickly and accurately. Carl's eyes took in everything. The scattered groceries, Harold's torn shirt, the circle of spectators with their phones, Tommy's aggressive posture, the way Harold was favoring his left side where he'd been shoved against the truck. Carl had seen similar scenes in a dozen different countries, the strong preying on the weak, while others watched and did nothing. But this was America, and that was Harold Martinez getting abused by a punk who had never put his life on the line for anything more meaningful than a bar fight. "Seems like there's been a misunderstanding here." Carl's voice carried the flat, matter-of-fact tone that career military men learn when they need civilians to understand that the conversation is about to go in a very different direction. Not threatening, not aggressive, just absolutely certain. "Harold, you okay, brother?" The word brother hit Harold like electricity. When had anyone last called him brother? When had anyone last looked at him and seen something other than an inconvenient old man taking up space in a world that had moved on without him? When had anyone last treated him like he mattered, like his life had value beyond the social security check he collected every month? Tommy looked around at the 8 men arranged in a loose semicircle, their relaxed poses somehow more intimidating than any aggressive display would have been. These weren't guys who needed to puff up and make noise to prove their toughness. They were men who had been tested in ways Tommy couldn't imagine, who had earned their confidence in places where pretense got you killed. And they were here for Harold. "This doesn't concern you, Grandpas," Tommy said, but his voice lacked the conviction it had carried when he was terrorizing a lone elderly man. Suddenly the odds had shifted from 8-1 in his favor to 8-1 against him, and the 8 were men who looked like they had handled worse situations than a parking lot confrontation with their breakfast coffee still warm in their bellies. Miguel Santos stepped forward, his prosthetic leg clicking slightly against the asphalt. "Actually, friend, it concerns us quite a bit." His voice carried a slight Texas accent and the patient tone of someone who had explained complex concepts to resistant audiences before. "See, Harold here served his country with the 1st Cav in Vietnam. That makes him family, and we take family business pretty seriously. The circle of phone-wielding spectators had gone quiet, sensing that they were witnessing something significant, something that transcended simple parking lot drama. This wasn't going to be the viral video they'd expected. This was becoming something else entirely, a reminder that some bonds run deeper than civilian understanding, that some debts of loyalty transcend time and circumstance. If you believe that service members deserve respect regardless of their age, and that true brotherhood never expires, hit that subscribe button now, because what happened next proves that some uniforms are worn on the inside where they can never be taken off, and some oaths are kept for life. Jerry Washington had been 22 when he earned his Bronze Star, leading a squad of Marines through a rice paddy that had been turned into a killing field by enemy machine gun positions. He'd lost 3 men that day, carried 2 wounded soldiers over half a mile through mud that grabbed at their boots like quicksand, all while mortar rounds dropped around them like deadly rain. The medal citation said he had distinguished himself by heroic achievement while engaged in combat operations. But Jerry knew the truth was simpler. You don't leave your brothers behind, ever, for any reason. Now 68 years old with arthritis in his knees and a hearing aid that whistled. When the wind was wrong, Jerry looked at Harold Martinez and saw something every civilian in that parking lot had missed. A fellow warrior who had carried the same burden, sworn the same oath, earned the same right to dignity that seemed to be in such short supply in modern America. Son, Jerry's voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had given orders under fire and had them followed without question. You need to step back and think real carefully about your next move. He didn't raise his voice, didn't make threats, didn't posture or preen. He simply stated a fact with the calm certainty that came from having faced down enemies a lot more dangerous than a parking lot bully with anger management issues. Tommy looked around at the circle of veterans, his swagger finally beginning to desert him as the reality of his situation began to penetrate. These weren't the elderly victims he was used to targeting. These were men who had volunteered to go places where people were actively trying to kill them, who had survived experiences that would have broken lesser men, who had earned their gray hair and weathered faces in ways Tommy's generation couldn't comprehend. David Park stepped closer, his movements carrying the careful precision of someone who had learned to conserve energy in extreme cold, who had fought Chinese forces at Chosin Reservoir when the temperature dropped to 27 below zero, and Marines were dying of frostbite as often as enemy bullets. You know what I learned in Korea? His voice was conversational, almost friendly. I learned that bullies are usually cowards, and cowards usually run when they're faced with real opposition. The crowd of spectators was changing too. The phones were still recording, but the energy had shifted from anticipation of violence to something more complex. Some of the younger observers were beginning to understand that they were witnessing something significant. The moment when a generation that had earned respect through sacrifice encountered a generation that expected respect as an entitlement. Harold was still gathering his scattered groceries, but now Carl Rodriguez knelt beside him, helping collect the cans and packages with the same careful attention he had once given to equipment checks before dangerous missions. Take your time, brother, Carl said quietly. We're not going anywhere. And in those simple words was contained a promise that Harold hadn't heard in decades. You are not alone. You are not forgotten. You matter. Tommy's girlfriend, Ashley, had been filming the entire encounter from their car, initially excited about the viral potential of her boyfriend dominating some random old man. But now she was seeing something else entirely through her phone screen. Her boyfriend facing down a group of men who carried themselves with the quiet confidence that comes from having been tested in ways she couldn't imagine. Men who didn't need to prove anything to anyone, who had already proved everything that mattered in places most people couldn't find on a map. Tommy, she called out, her voice carrying a note of concern he'd never heard before. Maybe we should just go. But Tommy was trapped now by his own bravado, by the audience he had played to, by the persona he had built around being the toughest guy in any room. Walking away would mean admitting he had been wrong, that he had misjudged the situation, that his victim wasn't as helpless as he had assumed. Miguel Santos understood the dynamic perfectly. He'd seen it in Iraq, The moment when insurgents realized they had picked a fight with professional soldiers instead of soft targets. The calculation that happens behind desperate eyes when bullies suddenly find themselves facing people who fight back with lethal competence. "Here's what's going to happen," Miguel said, his voice carrying the same tone he had used when explaining tactical situations to young soldiers whose lives depended on understanding instructions the first time. "You're going to apologize to Harold. Then you're going to help him load his groceries in his car. Then you're going to drive away and think real hard about how you treat other people." Tommy's mouth opened to protest, to reassert his dominance, to prove he wasn't intimidated by a bunch of old men on motorcycles. But the words died unspoken as he looked into 8 sets of eyes that had seen real combat, real brotherhood, real sacrifice. Eyes that held depths of experience he couldn't fathom, couldn't challenge, couldn't dismiss. Carl Rodriguez stood up, Harold's groceries now neatly collected in their bags, and placed a gentle hand on the older veteran's shoulder. "Harold served 2 tours in Vietnam with the 1st Cavalry Division," he announced to the crowd, his voice carrying enough to reach every spectator, every phone, every person who had chosen to watch rather than help. He was 19 years old when he volunteered to serve his country in a war nobody wanted to fight, in a place nobody wanted to go, for people who didn't want him there when he came home. The parking lot had gone completely silent now, even the ambient noise of traffic seeming to fade as Carl continued. He carried a machine gun that weighed 23 pounds, not counting ammunition. He spent 13 months in jungles where the humidity was so thick you could barely breathe, where every step might trigger a booby trap, where every shadow might hide an enemy who wanted to kill him simply because he was an American soldier. Harold's eyes had filled with tears, not from shame or pain, but from the overwhelming experience of having his service acknowledged, validated, honored by men who understood what it meant. When had anyone last spoken about his time in Vietnam as something to be proud of rather than something to be forgotten? When had anyone last treated his service as valuable rather than embarrassing? He came home to a country that called him baby killer. Carl's voice hardened slightly, carrying an edge that made several spectators step back unconsciously. He came home to protesters who spit on him at airports, to politicians who pretended his war never happened, to a nation that decided it was easier to forget about Vietnam than to honor the men who fought there. He's carried that burden for 55 years, mostly alone, mostly in silence. Tommy was no longer looking at Harold with contempt. Something in Carl's words, in the quiet dignity of the man he had been abusing, in the obvious respect these other veterans held for their brother, was beginning to penetrate his thick skull. This wasn't just some random old man he could push around for entertainment. This was someone who had volunteered to face death for his country before Tommy had even been born. Do you ever wonder what it takes to transform a bully into someone capable of basic human decency? Do you believe that some lessons can only be taught by people who have earned the right to teach them? Because what happened next in that Riverside parking lot proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon against ignorance is simply the truth, delivered by people who have lived it. Jerry Washington had seen this transformation before, the moment when someone realizes they have been operating from a position of ignorance rather than strength. He'd seen it in young Marines who thought they were tough until their first firefight taught them the difference between posturing and actual courage. He'd seen it in politicians who talked tough about war until they met soldiers who had actually fought in one. And he was seeing it now in Tommy Berkowitz, whose worldview was cracking under the weight of actual reality. "The thing about service," Jerry said, his voice carrying the patient tone of someone who had taught countless young men the difference between bravado and bravery, "is that it changes you. It teaches you that there are things more important than your own comfort, your own safety, your own ego. It teaches you that real strength comes from protecting people who can't protect themselves, not from hurting them." Harold was standing straighter now, his shoulders squared in a way they hadn't been in years. The presence of his brothers, the acknowledgement of his service, the simple fact that someone had come when he needed help, had restored something essential that had been slowly eroding over decades of civilian indifference. He wasn't just a forgotten old man anymore. He was Specialist Harold Martinez, machine gunner, 1st Cavalry Division, veteran of 13 months in combat zones, survivor of experiences that had killed better men than Tommy Berkowitz could ever hope to be. Ashley had stopped filming now, her phone forgotten in her lap, as she watched her boyfriend confront the reality of what he had become. She'd met Tommy when he was trying to impress her with stories of high school football glory and bar fights won against drunken opponents. She'd thought his aggression was confidence, his willingness to pick on weaker targets was strength. But seeing him face men who had earned their authority through genuine sacrifice was showing her the difference between a predator and a protector. David Park stepped forward, his movements still carrying the careful economy of motion learned during the frozen hell of the Korean War. "I was 18 when I went to Korea," he said, his voice conversational but somehow reaching every person in the parking lot. "Chinese forces outnumbered us 10 to 1. Temperature was so cold that rifles wouldn't fire, medical supplies froze. Solid, and men died of exposure as often as enemy action. You know what kept us alive? Looking out for each other, taking care of the guy next to you even when you barely had enough to take care of yourself." Tommy was beginning to understand that he wasn't just facing a group of old men on motorcycles. He was facing representatives of something larger than himself, something that connected him to a heritage of service and sacrifice that stretched back to the founding of the nation. These men had written checks to America payable up to and including their lives, and the country had cashed those checks without ever adequately repaying the debt. Carl Rodriguez could see the change happening, the slow deflation of false bravado, the dawning recognition that Tommy had made a fundamental error in judgment. It was the same expression Carl had seen on the faces of young soldiers when they realized that war wasn't like the movies, that real combat was about protecting your brothers rather than proving your toughness, that heroism was usually quiet and often involved helping people rather than hurting them. "Harold here earned 2 Purple Hearts in Vietnam," Carl continued, his voice carrying the respect that one warrior holds for another. "First one was for shrapnel wounds when his fire base came under mortar attack. He stayed at his machine gun position even after he was bleeding, kept laying down covering fire so his unit could get to safety. Second one was for a sniper's bullet that went through his shoulder. Still completed his mission, still brought his entire squad home alive." The crowd was hanging on every word now, understanding that they were witnessing something extraordinary. The intersection of 2 generations, 2 worldviews, 2 completely different understandings of what it meant to be strong. The younger generation that had been raised on video games and social media bravado was meeting men who had learned about real courage in places where pretense could get you killed. Harold's voice was stronger now when he spoke, carrying echoes of the young soldier who had once given orders under fire. "I didn't serve for recognition," he said quietly, looking directly at Tommy for the first time since the confrontation began. "I served because it was my duty, because this country gave me opportunities, and when it needed me to give something back, I volunteered." The simple dignity in those words hit harder than any threat or insult could have. Miguel Santos nodded his approval, recognizing the quiet pride of a man who had done his job without expecting praise or reward. "That's what service looks like," he said, addressing not just Tommy but the entire crowd of spectators. "It's not about being the toughest guy in the room. It's about being willing to stand up when your country needs you, even when it's dangerous, even when it's unpopular, even when people back home don't understand what you're fighting for." Tommy's hands had dropped to his sides, his aggressive posture melting away as the full weight of his actions began to sink in. He had been bullying a man who had risked his life for the freedom Tommy enjoyed, who had faced dangers Tommy couldn't imagine, who had earned respect through sacrifice while Tommy had tried to claim it through intimidation. The equation was so lopsided it was almost comical, except that nothing about the situation was funny anymore. Ashley got out of the car and walked over to Tommy, her expression carrying a mix of shame and determination. "I'm sorry," she said, looking directly at Harold. "We didn't know. That doesn't excuse what happened, but we didn't understand who you are, what you've done for all of us." Her voice was sincere, carrying the recognition that she had been complicit in something that violated basic human decency. But it was Tommy who surprised everyone, including himself. The confrontation with men who had earned their authority through genuine sacrifice had cracked something open inside him, had forced him to confront the emptiness of his own achievements, the hollowness of respect gained through fear, rather. then earned through service. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was wrong. I was completely wrong." Harold looked at the young man who had been terrorizing him just minutes before, seeing something that the others might have missed. A person capable of growth, someone who could learn from this experience rather than simply be humiliated by it. "We all make mistakes," Harold said quietly. "The measure of a man isn't whether he falls down. It's whether he gets back up and tries to be better." The transformation was happening in real time, captured by dozens of phones, but transcending simple social media drama. This was becoming something else entirely, a moment of genuine human connection, a bridge between generations that had been talking past each other for decades, a reminder that wisdom often comes from the most unexpected sources. Carl Rodriguez could see that the immediate crisis had passed, that Tommy was no longer a threat, that Harold was safe among brothers who would never let him face something like this alone again. But he also understood that this moment represented something larger, an opportunity to teach not just Tommy, but everyone present, everyone who would eventually see the videos, about the debt that civilian society owed to the men and women who had served. The lesson was just beginning, and it would echo far beyond this parking lot, far beyond this afternoon, into conversations that would happen around dinner tables and in classrooms and wherever people gathered to discuss what it meant to be American, what it meant to honor those who had served, what it meant to build a society worthy of the sacrifices made in its defense. Because sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with words, with dignity, with the quiet insistence that every person's service matters, that every veteran's story deserves to be heard, that respect isn't something you take from others, but something you earn through your own actions. The afternoon sun was still beating down on the Walmart parking lot, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Where there had been tension and the promise of violence, now there was something approaching understanding. Tommy knelt down and began helping Harold load his groceries into his car, his movements careful and respectful, as if he was handling something precious rather than just canned goods and household supplies. Jerry Washington watched the interaction with the satisfaction of someone who had seen a teaching moment recognized and embraced. In his decades of military service, he had learned that the most effective way to change someone's behavior wasn't through punishment or humiliation, but through education. Show someone the truth, help them understand the consequences of their actions, and most people will choose to be better than they were. "You know what I learned in the Marines?" Jerry said, his voice carrying far enough for the crowd to hear. "I learned that every person you meet is carrying battles you know nothing about." Harold here came home from Vietnam to find out that the girl he was going to marry had moved on with someone else. His mother had died while he was overseas, and nobody told him until he got back because they were afraid it would distract him from staying alive. He spent 2 years in VA hospitals dealing with injuries that weren't just physical. Harold's eyes widened slightly. He had never told anyone. Those details had carried those particular griefs alone for more than 5 decades. But somehow Jerry had known, had understood that the wounds from war weren't always visible, weren't always the kind that showed up in medical records or disability claims. He came home to find out that his factory job had been given to someone else. Jerry continued, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone reciting established facts. Spent 6 months sleeping in his car because nobody wanted to rent to a veteran. Took whatever work he could find. Sent most of his paycheck to his younger sister so she could finish nursing school. Never married, never had kids. Spent his whole life taking care of other people instead of building the life he probably dreamed about when he was 19 and thought he was going to come home to parades and gratitude. The crowd was silent now, phones forgotten, completely absorbed in a story that was playing out like a novel, except that every word was true. Every detail was carved from the lived experience of a man who had given everything and asked for nothing in return. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was education, delivered by people who had earned the right to teach these lessons through their own sacrifice. David Park stepped forward, his weathered hands helping Tommy arrange groceries in Harold's trunk with the same careful attention he had once given to equipment that had to function perfectly in life-or-death situations. "The thing about service," David said quietly, "is that it doesn't end when you take off the uniform. Harold here has been serving his community for 50, Years since he came home. Volunteers at the food bank every Thursday, reads to kids at the library on Saturdays, visits veterans in the hospital who don't have any family left. Harold's face flushed with embarrassment. He had never thought of those activities as service, had never connected his weekly routines to his military experience. They were just things he did, ways to fill time and maybe make the world a little bit better in whatever small way he could manage. But hearing David describe them as service, as a continuation of the oath he had sworn so many years ago, gave them new meaning. Tommy looked up from arranging canned goods, his expression carrying a complexity that hadn't been there an hour earlier. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked Harold directly. When I was being an asshole, why didn't you tell me you were a veteran? Why didn't you tell me what you'd done?" Harold's answer came without hesitation, carrying the quiet dignity that had sustained him through decades of civilian indifference. "Because I didn't serve for recognition. I served because it was my duty. And besides," he added with a slight smile that transformed his weathered features, "would it have mattered? Would you have treated me differently if you'd known? Or would you have just thought I was lying?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, forcing Tommy to confront uncomfortable truths about his own assumptions, his own prejudices, his own willingness to dismiss elderly people as irrelevant obstacles rather than human beings with their own stories of triumph and loss. The honest answer was that he probably would have assumed Harold was lying, would have escalated the confrontation rather than backing down. Miguel Santos recognized the moment of genuine reflection and decided to push it further. "That's the problem with respect," he said, his voice carrying the teaching tone of someone who had trained countless young soldiers. "Too many people think it's something you earn by being tough, by dominating other people, by making them afraid of you. But real respect comes from service, from sacrifice, from putting something bigger than yourself first. These men," he gestured to his fellow veterans, "they earned respect in places where courage wasn't optional, where looking out for your brothers meant the difference between life and death." Ashley had been silent through most of the exchange, but now she found her voice. "I recorded the whole thing," she said, holding up her phone with a mixture of shame and determination. "I was going to post it online, make fun of what Tommy did, to you. But now," she looked at Harold with genuine respect, "now I want to delete it. This isn't something that should be turned into entertainment." Carl Rodriguez shook his head gently. "Don't delete it," he said, surprising everyone. "But don't post it the way you planned either. Post it with the whole story. Let people see what happened here today. Let them understand what they witnessed. Show them that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is admit you were wrong and try to be better." The suggestion carried wisdom that transcended the immediate situation. In an age of viral videos and social media outrage, here was an opportunity to create something different. Content that educated rather than simply entertained, that built bridges rather than burning them, that showed the possibility of growth and redemption rather than just conflict and humiliation. Tommy stood up, his task of loading groceries complete, and extended his hand to Harold. "I don't know how to make this right," he said, his voice carrying genuine regret. "I don't know how to apologize for what I did, for what I was thinking, for how I treated you. But I want to learn. I want to understand. I want to be better than I was an hour ago." Harold looked at the extended hand for a long moment, then clasped it firmly. The handshake carried more weight than any formal ceremony, more meaning than any official recognition. It was the moment when two generations connected across a divide that had seemed unbridgeable, when understanding replaced ignorance, when respect was offered freely rather than demanded through intimidation. "You already are better," Harold said, quietly. "The fact that you can admit you were wrong, that you want to learn, that you're willing to change, that takes courage. Different kind of courage than what we needed in combat, but courage all the same." Jerry Washington nodded his approval, recognizing the moment when a lesson had been truly learned rather than simply heard. "This is what America looks like when it works," he said, addressing not just the immediate participants but the larger crowd that had witnessed the transformation. Different generations, different backgrounds, different experiences, but all of us trying to figure out how to live together with dignity and respect. The circle of veterans began to relax, their protective formation dissolving as the crisis passed and brotherhood was extended to include new members. Carl Rodriguez pulled out his wallet and extracted a business card, handing it to Tommy. "Combat Veterans Motorcycle Association Riverside Chapter," he said. "We meet every Tuesday at Denny's on Magnolia. You're not a veteran, but you're welcome to come learn about what service means, what brotherhood looks like when it's earned rather than demanded." Tommy took the card with hands that were slightly trembling, understanding that he was being offered something precious, the opportunity to learn from men who had earned wisdom through experience rather than simply claiming it through arrogance. "I'll be there," he said, and everyone present believed he meant it. David Park turned to Harold, his expression carrying the warmth of recognition between brothers. "And you, Harold Martinez, you're coming too. No more excuses about not fitting in. No more carrying this burden alone. These men," he gestured to the other veterans, "they're your family. We all are. It's time you came home." Harold's eyes filled with tears again, but these were different tears than the ones shed in humiliation earlier. These were tears of relief, of recognition, of finally belonging somewhere after decades of isolation. The war had ended 55 years ago, but his service to his brothers was just beginning again. The crowd began to disperse, spectators returning to their own lives but carrying with them something they hadn't expected to find in a Walmart parking lot. A story of redemption, a lesson in respect, a reminder that heroism often looks like an elderly man picking up scattered groceries with quiet dignity, while bullies learn what real strength actually means. Ashley took one last look around at the scene, then deliberately deleted the original video she had planned to post. Instead, she began recording again, this time capturing Harold shaking hands with each veteran, Tommy asking genuine questions about service and sacrifice, the transformation of a confrontation into a teaching moment that would echo far beyond. This afternoon, Carl Rodriguez mounted his motorcycle, then looked back at Harold one more time. "Same time next week, brother. We'll be expecting you." The promise carried the weight of an oath, the certainty of men who had learned that some commitments are sacred, that some bonds can never be broken no matter how much time passes or how far apart life takes you. As the motorcycles rumbled to life and began pulling out of the parking lot, Harold stood beside his car and watched them go, understanding that something fundamental had changed in his life. He wasn't alone anymore. He had brothers again. He had a purpose again. He had a place where his service mattered, where his stories would be heard by people who understood them, where his sacrifice would be honored by men who had made similar sacrifices. Tommy and Ashley drove away in their car, carrying with them a conversation that would last for hours, a relationship that would be forever changed by witnessing real courage in action, an understanding that respect isn't something you take from others but something you earn through your own choices. The video Ashley would eventually post would go viral, but not for the reasons she had originally intended. It would become a teaching moment shared across social media platforms, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful transformations happen not through violence or humiliation, but through education delivered by people who have earned the right to teach. The parking lot returned to normal, shoppers coming and going with their weekly errands, completely unaware that they were walking through a space where something significant had just occurred. But the impact would ripple outward, carried in conversations and social media posts and the changed behavior of people who had witnessed what happens when different generations choose understanding over conflict, when service is honored rather than forgotten, when brotherhood extends beyond the boundaries of age and experience to include anyone willing to learn what real strength looks like. Harold Martinez drove home to his small apartment, but he wasn't the same man who had left for the grocery store that morning. He was no longer just a forgotten veteran carrying invisible wounds in isolation. He was a member of a brotherhood that would never abandon him, never forget his service, never let him face the world's indifference alone again. Tuesday couldn't come soon enough, because sometimes the most important battles are won not with weapons but with patience, not with force but with education, not with dominance but with the quiet insistence that every person's dignity matters, that every veteran's service deserves recognition, that every act of courage, whether in combat or in a parking lot confrontation, has the power to change the world one conversation at a time. In the end, Harold Martinez had served his country twice. Once as a young soldier in the jungles of Vietnam, and again as an elderly veteran in a California parking lot, teaching a new generation what service really means and proving that some uniforms are worn on the inside where they can never be taken off. That's the power of brotherhood. That's the meaning of service. That's what happens when people choose to see the hero behind the wrinkles, the warrior behind the gray hair, the sacrifice behind the quiet dignity of men and women who answered their country's call when it mattered most. If this story moved you, if you believe that veterans deserve our respect regardless of their age, if you think that every act of service should be honored rather than forgotten, share your thoughts in the comments below. Because Harold's story isn't unique, there are thousands of veterans just like him, carrying similar burdens, deserving similar recognition, waiting for someone to see past their age to the courage that still lives in their hearts.